I'm John Buchanan. Now what we're going to do within this video is to look at some of the new options within Bounce in Place which have been introduced with Logic 11.1, which are kind of interesting and have some useful implications, particularly I think for beat processing, interesting ways of being able to take individual slices of audio and rapidly apply a series of processes to those to make beats more our own and a little bit less predictable. We're going to start with predictable, however. What I've done is to import one of the Logic loops into this project. This one's called Before Sunrise Beat 01. So if you want to go and find it and work with exactly the same piece of audio, that's the file that you're looking for, and it sounds like this. And sometimes a thing is so good you need to hear it 4 times. Okay, so here we are, we've got our loop and there it is just repeating. As it turns out, I actually only need one of these regions, but we'll come to that in just a moment. So effectively what Bounce in Place has always allowed us to do is to select anything within Logic, whether that is a software instrument region or an audio region, and effectively from that create a new audio track. And we've always had the option to fold down effects on a particular track, even incorporating automation data if we want to effectively create an audio file from whatever we choose to select. And it's useful, particularly for things like taking a whole region and wanting to reverse it, some things that you just can't do with MIDI, for instance. So Bounce in Place has always been really useful, but its capabilities have been expanded with 11.1. So what I'm going to do is to get rid of the 3 copies and just leave myself with this original region. And what I'm also going to do is to then come to my scissors tool and we're going to do the classic, which is the multiple divide. Now effectively what this means is that I can click on the division that I want to chop this region up into. So I'm selecting the first 16th note, hold down the option button, and when I release, what I get is all of these individual slices in one go. So they are all 16th notes long, all 16th notes long. Again, another hard thing to say. Always setting myself little challenges. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit so we can see these slices a little bit more clearly. And then what I'm going to do is to select them all, and I'm going to control click, and I'm going to come to Bounce in Place, which I've now done. I'm about to do this for the 2 millionth time on this channel. However, for the first time on this channel, we're going to see the extended options. Okay, so Bounce Regions in Place looks the same as it used to, but there are a couple of things that are worth noting. So we've been through these options before. As I say, the opportunity to include various things, including pan information, the idea that we can bypass effects plugins or incorporate them, use them however we like, and the idea that we can either leave, mute, or delete the original piece of audio. As I've mentioned before, the idea that you're going to delete the original file when rendering the new one has always felt like a tightrope act that feels unnecessarily dangerous. So I would either go with leave or mute, and effectively that just deals with what's going to happen to the original file. But the new thing is here. So what we have a chance to do now is to render this file however we like. So in other words, what I can either do is I can render 1 file per track. This is new. And what I can also do is to render 1 file per region. So what is the difference? Well, let's just select one of these for a moment. If I render 1 file per track, what that's going to do effectively is to give me what I've got already. In other words, it's going to take all of the data that's here and it's going to render it onto a new track. So what is different here? Well, we can see that the only function that has really been folded down is that I've got -2 in my level on the original. We can see the waveform's a certain size, and effectively what's happened is that that kind of -2, in other words taking 2 dB off the gain, has been folded down into the Bounce in Place version. Otherwise, effectively I've got the same region that I had before. It's just been reprocessed as a new file. So not that useful, bearing in mind my file was already a bar long. So let's just undo that step and we'll go back to the original. Now the much more interesting one, I think, if we Bounce in Place now, is to come to the idea that what we could do is to render 1 new audio file per region. Now what this effectively is going to do when I select this option is that this is going to go through, scan every single one of these 16th note slices, create a new 16th note slice on the track below, but crucially all of those will be independent audio files. And I'm going to show you why that's going to be useful in just a moment. So I'm going to go for this option, Hit OK, and I think we'll see Logic busily working away, a bit like a sewing machine, I think, just going through and creating new little slices for every single thing. Now, every single thing, that wasn't very technical, was it? Every new region is now a new audio file. Now, we should see that, I think, within the project settings for this project now. We had one audio file, and now we've got a whole bunch of them, because effectively what they've done is to be created from this bounce in place process. So all of these are now independent audio files. And of course, the reason why that's useful is now what I can do without in any way destructively processing or doing something permanent to any other slice, I can provide the sort of audio only processing that we can apply when we've got individual audio files for every region. For instance, I can click on this guy right here, and what I can do is to double click him. I've just decided this slice is male. I have no idea why. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reverse it. So that slice turns around. Equally, I can select this slice here, and I can decide that she needs to be backwards as well. And what I could do would be to do that and reverse that particular slice. But of course, I can go further than this. Now, the next thing to say is that we're now going to sort of morph from bounce in place as one concept into the concept of finding interesting and new ways to be able to render individual processing to individual audio files. So we're going to move on from the idea of bounce in place, which we've now done. Remember, all 16 of these files are now completely independent audio files. And what we're going to do next is to look at the idea of flex editing, but not across a whole track, but on individual slices of a track. I'll show you what I mean. What I can do, let's just open up a couple more options within here for a moment. Let's suppose that on this downbeat here, this second beat of the bar, I wanted to apply flex editing to just this individual slice. Well, I can do that by coming up to flex and follow and turning that on for that slice. And what we're going to discover is that the rest of the audio file has remained completely unprocessed, but this one is now available for flex editing. What I can then do is to choose the processor, the type of flex time editing I want to apply. I'm going to go for speed. And again, that won't then apply that to every single slice within the region. It's just highlighting this one. And of course, what I can then do is to do my time stretchy stuff and have fun with thinking about putting in some transient markers and deciding where I want those to go. And what I can then do is to slice out and stretch out this beat however I like. Now I'm going to make that ridiculously long. We can see that it's overhanging the following little bit of audio, but that's okay, because what I can also do is to control click this, come to trim, and what I can then do is to make sure that the region end stops at the next region. And what that will do is to bring back the end of that little bit of audio file. Remember, it's not a region now, it's an audio file in its own right. And what that's going to do is to give that its own space, its own shape. And again, if I wanted to, I could do that in other ways as well. So we could maybe produce something here which did something similar. Again, just to repeat that process, what I could do would be to turn on this tiny little slice here. From a flex editing perspective, I'm going to have to keep the same algorithm, because of course that applies across a whole track. I can then create the little offsets that I want. I can stretch out this hit, make it do something interesting. And again, what I can then do is to make sure that it's the length I need it to be by, again, coming to trim and making sure that the end stops at the next region. So what I'm also going to do is to just reverse this slice too. So I'm just going through and I'm just applying some individual file-based processing to a couple of slices. And what that's going to do is to give us a loop that sounds a bit more like this. Okay, so what we've done is we've turned this original loop into something which is a little bit more ours, and that's fine. And now we're going to look at another type of processing that we can apply to all of this. So far, remember, what we've done is we've used the new bounce in place to render a new audio file for each individual slice. And now, because they're all independent audio files, what we can do is to do whatever we like to each individual slice. And of course, it won't have any implications for any of the other slices because they're all completely independent. But what Logic also has is this amazing capacity to produce what we refer to as selection-based processing. So let's suppose for a moment what I wanted to do would be to say, okay, I want to put a bit crusher on this sound, but I only want that bit crusher to apply to the first slice of this audio file. Okay, well, under normal circumstances, what that might mean would be that I'd have to duplicate this track, take that slice down to that track, set up my bit crusher, and rely on the fact that that particular bit of processing was going to come from a different track. The other way that I could do it, I suppose, would be to set up the bit crusher for this track and then automate the bypass button so it only switched on for a particular region. Both of those things are a little bit fiddly and they're taking up more space and time than I need them to do. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to select two of these individual slices here, and then I'm going to come to the functions menu and I'm going to come to selection-based processing. Now this literally then means that anything I configure within this particular window is going to be applicable to just the individual slices that I've set up. Now the way that this works is as follows. What I'm actually going to do is to reset the choices that are automatically here. And effectively what we'll do is we'll start from scratch. So I've got two separate lanes. You can think of these as being lanes, the A lane and the B lane. And effectively what I can do, a bit like Logic's regular inserts, is I can begin to stack up particular effects within either the A or the B lanes. So let's suppose I did want my bit crusher. I'm going to come down to distortion, find a bit crusher, and what I can then do is to configure the settings that I want. I'm going to go with 8-bit, a little bit of downsampling. I think that would be nice. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to put that into a tiny bit of a reverb. I'm going to come and find, let's say, chroma verb. And I'm going to select the airy algorithm and I'm going to just create a little 2.5 second-ish, 2.5 second reverb. And effectively what that's going to do is to provide me with some downsampling, effectively a kind of roughing up of the sound through the bit crusher and then a little bit of space around that. I can close down this interface and what I can then do is I can preview what that will sound like. Now remember, I've selected these two regions. So these are the two regions we're going to hear previewed. Different type of record now. Okay, but effectively all we're doing now is looping around this section that we have selected. Now what's really interesting is that those regions don't have to be contiguous. I'm going to use a Logic word. In other words, they don't have to be next to each other. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to select this region over here as well. So these two and this one. And what I can then do is to press the apply button. Now, before I do, I'm just going to show you a couple of other things. I can either use this to create a brand new take, which means I'm going to get a take folder which has got this selection-based processing as an alternative to these originals. I can also create an effect tail if I want to, so that anything spatial, like the chroma verb, effectively isn't going to get cut off. Those are my options. And what I can also do is to, if I want to, ask Logic to look out for any gain problems that might arise as a result of the selections that I've got there. So I suspect here that I'm going to find an opportunity to make sure that I don't overload the mix, for instance. But I'm feeling okay about my choices and I don't want to produce a gain change that I don't have to, so I'm going to hit apply. Now what that's going to do is effectively replace the regions within my new collection of audio files with these processed versions. So now my loop sounds like this and the effects that I have selected have been baked in to this file. And that's quite nice. So suddenly, because I've got my original, I can be brave with the decisions that I can make here. And I think that's going to feel quite nice. Okay, so what can I do in the B lane? Well, here I've got an opportunity to start all over again with a completely different set of plugins if I want to. Now, what's quite interesting about this is that, of course, those plugins can be anything, not just the kind of one-stop insert effects we've already configured and we might consider, but they can be some of the kind of moving-based effects like step effects or fat effects or beat breaker even. That might be quite interesting. So if we were to select, for example, this one, which we've already processed, and the following, let's say, 4 regions up to this point. And what I do in the B lane is to set up beat breaker, let's say, for instance, which I'm going to find in multi-effects. Then what I've got a chance to do here is to now come and find something which feels like it's going to, in some way, kind of interrupt and do something interesting with the way that this might play. So I can choose anything here. I think I'm up for something a little bit time-based. I'm going to come to halftime, but I don't want a halftime effect. I'm going to drop down into here, in fact, and replace halftime with, I don't know, something else that feels like it's going to be a bit stuttery. This is again where I'm just going to get completely seduced by a name. Grain drama? I mean, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to press the preview button again, and what we'll hear is whatever grain drama is applied to these collection of regions that I've got here. Again, I've just chosen these 5. That's really nice. I really do like that a lot. I think, however, that's going to be too much grain drama for me. So I'm going to take out that hit there and we'll have the drama on either side of it. There we are. And what I'm going to do is to press the apply button again. And what we should find, sure enough, is that this one has remained completely untouched, but what we've got is our changes applied to the other sides. I think this is a really interesting way of applying processing. Remember that, effectively, this window is open, but unless I press the apply button, nothing else is changing. So I'm about to press play, and none of Beat Breaker or any of the other effects that we configured in the A lane are now being applied, because they're waiting for me to choose which regions to apply them to. Okay, so I've actually made a mistake, because I didn't want to apply this to these first 2 regions, but because I've forgotten to deselect them, the grain drama is being applied to these first 2 slices as well. Okay, so what are my options here? Remember, this is selection-based processing, and I've processed this selection. Well, I do have an undo button down at the bottom of this window as well. So actually, it turns out that I should be able to go back a step to where I was, deselect these, and then reapply them. And that should, again, provide the processing that I want on the regions that I want, but it should leave the first 2 alone. I've also ended up with a very odd loop length here, which is a little bit of a surprise. Let's have a listen to this now. I think that's really nice. Now, one thing that would be really worth bearing in mind as well is if I had selected the new take option, effectively these would be available as alternatives to the unprocessed version. And what that would be useful for would be if I suddenly decided that I wanted to turn this into a 4-bar pattern and I didn't want the same processing every single time. I'm about to loop this and make this part of my project, but this little bit of grain drama, very, very fond of that name, is going to play out in every single one of those bars for that region. Now, that's fine, but it might be worth considering using that take option if it sort of feels like this is going to become too repetitive. But effectively, the moment we sort of duplicate all of this and we put it in maybe with another track element as well, I think this is quite an interesting way of being able to provide variation in your beats. Sounds like this. So this is just one of the patterns that, again, exists within the loop library. Go and find it if you want to. Gradient sky pattern. I think it's a really interesting lo-fi sound. So what we've actually done here is to look at 3 separate techniques, all of which I think are quite interesting ways of thinking about providing extra richness when it comes to programming, beats in particular. So the first thing we did was to import our audio loop from the loop browser, chop it up, and then what we did was to use the new bounce in place features to effectively produce a new audio file for every single one of those regions, each one rendered individually side by side as a new audio file. And what that meant was we were able to reverse individual slices and also apply flex time processing on a per slice basis rather than across the entire track. That was the first thing. The next thing we did was to open up the idea of selection-based processing. This idea that what we can do is to create lanes of effects plugins which can then be applied to individual audio regions. So rather than an insert that basically just sits over an entire track and just processes everything on that track. What we do instead is to destructively apply that processing to individual slices. And what that does is to give us the opportunity to kind of think of every single slice within our audio file almost as a little jigsaw piece, which can have its own color, its own texture, and its own role to play within the project. And then what we've done obviously is to put it in alongside this pattern, and we can begin to see how we can take any loop into brand new places of our own with our own sound design applied to that region. And the great thing, of course, is I can always just go back to that original loop, which is just sitting there muted at the top of my project if I want to do this all over again. One last thing to say, just because you've applied selection-based processing once doesn't mean you can't do it again. I could remove those plugins from the selection processing window, set up new ones, and reapply them, adding effects on top of other effects. Logic, man. It's amazing, isn't it?